Welcome to Stab the Dragon Productions for episode number 162. As today we are doing a book review of the late Bill Sloan's history, The Darkest Summer, Pusan and Inchon, 1950, The Battles That Saved South Korea and the Marines from Extinction. New York, Simon & Schuster, 2009, 383 pages. I read this book in March of 2024, this year, and my overall impression is outstanding. 9 out of 10. I've read several histories of the Korean War, including the classic This Kind of War by T.R. Fehrenbach, probably the best book on the subject and one of the best history books I've ever read. And Sloan's work comes in just beneath Fehrenbach's in regards to the Korean War. What are the main ideas of this book? The title gives us the main ideas, pretty much. The attack by the communists in June of 1950 led to one of the darkest periods, the worst defeats, the most trying of times for the United States military in our history. This book only covers the battles for Pusan and Inchon, with very little about the battle for Chosin and the second huge defeat of our armed forces in 6 months. And it really doesn't cover the long-standing hill wars to gain and maintain the DMZ. But besides telling the story of the first 6 months of the war, 3 months really, 3 to 4 months, Sloan tells the story of how the Democrat administration of Truman was planning to eliminate the Marine Corps as unnecessary, combining all the armed forces into one whole thing. I think kind of like maybe how Canada does it, but how the Marines' performance in the war not only saved the day for the American military in the Korean War, but it preserved their place in our armed forces for the foreseeable future. Other main points include communism is evil. The Army, just 5 years out of winning World War II, was a shambles. So those are the main ideas of the book. And MacArthur was crazy. That's thrown in there as well. So who should read this book and why? Around the years 2000 to 2003, I read several books on the Korean War because it was the 50th anniversary, and then a few more over the years ever since. This book I picked up because I am the father of a soldier currently serving in Korea, and with all the current events, the geopolitical mess that the world is in right now, one of the lessons of this book is we should listen to what our enemies say. They are going to do what they say. I think we should all be on a war footing since, well, I don't know, several years ago. So if you're thinking about the world situation and it's getting more and more dangerous, and if you have a loved one in Korea or in the military, you should read this book. Secondly, if you are, like me, a history buff and want one book to read about the Korean War, you should probably read this book. Oh, but wait a minute, what about Fehrenbach's book? Didn't I say it was the best ever? Yeah, but also at 483 pages, Fehrenbach is a deeper read, and he does cover way more territory. So if you want an excellent book that is shorter, more concise, then you go for The Darkest Summer by Sloan. If you're a military history nerd, this book is a must. You got to add this one to your Korean War section, your Korean War reading list. Fourth, if you are a United States Marine, this book is clearly intended for you as well. Because it makes the Marines the heroes, really, at which they were. Now, if you are in the U.S. Army, I think this book is also for you, even though I should say especially because if you're in the Army. The Army comes across as inept, unprepared, ill-led, ill-trained, as well as unmotivated and out of shape. So there are some strong warnings in this book, and I think it would be a good warning if you are in the Army today to read this book. If you're a teacher, of American history, either at the high school or at the college level, I would say read this book. If you're a politician at the federal or state level, you should read this book. The Korean War is a huge example of failed politicians, bad political policies. It's all about that, and as well as it portrays communism for what it is. If you work in the defense industry, I think you should read this book. Lastly, if you're in the movie industry, or if you aspire to be, this book has so much that should be made into a movie. There simply are not enough movies about the Korean War. Now, notably, there's a couple of new Chinese films. In 2020, there was a movie called The Sacrifice about one battle that late in the war that the Chinese released. And then there's a second one released the next year, 2021, called The Battle at Lake Changjin. And that one deals about the Battle of Chosin Reservoir in 1950. And that's a blockbuster hit in China. So you have to ask, why are the Chinese suddenly keen on releasing movies about the Korean War? Listen to your enemies. Pay attention. Now, what are some of the takeaways and applications from the book? From the opening pages, the book serves up the lesson that if you are not prepared for war, your enemies will try to take advantage of you and start a war. So I'm going to read some quotes now. Pages 1 through 4 to start off with. The way he starts the book is just simply fantastic. So here you go. First sentence really sets the tone for the whole book. So this is a key about writing, and that Sloan was a wonderful author here. So here's the first sentence, chapter 1. Chapter 1 title, Suddenly a Not So Sudden War. Again, excellent title for the chapter. As darkness fell on Saturday, June 24, 1950, it was party time in Seoul, capital of the fledgling Republic of South Korea. A bountiful rice harvest depended on the torrential downpours of the summer monsoon season. The spring had been unseasonably dry, but now it appeared certain that the indispensable rains were on their way. In anticipation, Republic of Korea Army Headquarters had authorized 15-day leaves for thousands of enlisted men to allow them to help their families in the rice paddies. Many other troops in the Rock Defensive Force, stationed at the 38th parallel, had been given the weekend off as a reward for serving through months of hostile incidents and false alarms along the frontier. They were comforting, perhaps necessary gestures toward the troops, but their effect was to leave fewer than a third of the 38,000-man ROK forces assigned to border defense on duty at the parallel. In embassy bars and other elite venues, the 2,000 members of the American diplomatic mission in Seoul also came out to play. And then on page 3, the ROKs didn't have a single tank or combat aircraft. They had no heavy artillery, large-bore 4.2-inch mortars, recoilless rifles for anti-tank warfare, or spare parts for their vehicles. Up-to-date weaponry had been withheld from the South Koreans on orders from Washington for fear that overzealous ROK officers might use it to attack North Korea. Nevertheless, U.S. Ambassador John Muccio's first secretary, Harold Noble, had confidently assured the powers at home that the ROKs can not only stop an attack but move north and capture the communist capital in 2 weeks. Wow. So yeah, that's how we start. Okay, page 4. Here we go. This is how we start the book. Poised within a few dozen yards of the 38th parallel on that rainy Sunday morning stood 90,000 North Korean troops, 7 infantry divisions, plus another infantry regiment, an armored brigade, a motorcycle regiment, and a brigade of border guards. Despite their exceptionally large numbers, they were apparently unnoticed by the ROKs or the Americans, possibly because the attention of the South Korean and American officers was focused elsewhere. You think? The NKPA, North Korean People's Army, troops were supported by 150 Soviet T-34 medium tanks, 200 combat aircraft, numerous 122 millimeter howitzers, 76 millimeter self-propelled guns, and heavy mortars. They had been standing by ever since Friday, June 23rd, awaiting final orders to invade South Korea. Yeah, a lesson in preparedness. Let me see. Page 21 of the 23. This is the political side. Some of the gravest damage inflicted on U.S. military capabilities in the nation's history resulted from Truman's appointment in March of 1950 of Lewis Johnson to succeed James Forrestal as head of the recently created Department of Defense, which combined the old cabinet-level departments of War and Navy. A large, forceful, wealthy lawyer from West Virginia, Johnson already had a deserved reputation as a disruptive publicity hound. During World War II, he had been fired by President Roosevelt as an Assistant Secretary of War because of his self-serving meddling. But Johnson had been a key supporter and fundraiser for Truman during the 1948 presidential campaign, politics at its best, in which Truman was a heavy underdog. When Truman won, to the surprise of almost everyone, he returned Johnson's favors by naming him Defense Secretary, a job Johnson hoped to use as his own stepping stone to the presidency. In the meantime, Johnson's main priorities were to slash military spending, make heads roll at the Pentagon, and help Truman realize an obsession to unify the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines into a single cut-rate military organization, a plan bitterly opposed by each service. Johnson made political hay and received widespread public applause for these dramatic savings to American taxpayers. U.S. infantry divisions in the Far East were shorn of 62% of their firepower, and troops in Japan were left with barely a 45-day supply of ammunition. Virtually every Army regiment was reduced to only 2 battalions instead of the prescribed 3, and every company lost 1 of its 3 authorized rifle platoons. Tanks and all other heavy types of equipment were in pathetically short supply, and often what was available was pathetically obsolete. The dire lack of funds and equipment hovered like a vulture over the American military in the summer of 1950, and every member of every combat unit felt its impact. When politicians do stupid stuff, soldiers die, their wives become widows, and their children become orphans. So that's how this book starts. Now, some more takeaways and applications from the book. The stark differences between the Marine Corps and the Army are shown throughout the book, including the toughness of individual Marines versus the toughness of soldiers, the quality of leadership at company, battalion, regimental levels, and even higher than that. Also, the way the Marine concept of combined arms worked. They had artillery, tanks, infantry, air wings, all working together in a brilliant fashion. It was highly effective. The Army, not so much. Sadly, under today's leadership, since the Obama years, the Marines have been giving up their artillery and tanks. They're pivoting to the Far East. I get that. That makes sense. But they're giving up their artillery and their tanks. Okay. I think it's a huge mistake. Sloan is not the only author I've read that makes these points about the Marines. Lack of a coherent plan for after the Inchon landings and the battle for Seoul is also stressed in the book. Sloan shows how MacArthur was pretty much insane and delusional, at, you know, in a lot of ways, and describes how Truman then failed to give proper direction to MacArthur. Those two were not working well, and it was a lack of leadership on Truman's part, and it was a craziness on MacArthur's part. So this sets the stage for a senseless plan that, when you combined it with MacArthur ignoring intelligence that said the Chinese were getting involved, led to disaster. Sloan believes that if MacArthur had just taken the southern portion of North Korea from about where Pyongyang is, that the Chinese would have let us alone. The Chinese only wanted a border state between them and us, to kind of a shock absorber kind of a thing, and they would let us control the rest of Korea. But MacArthur wanted a war with China, which the U.S. simply was not interested in, was not prepared for, and would have been probably a bad idea. But also, another takeaway and application. Sloan points to General Eddie Craig, commander of the Marine Brigade, as probably the biggest hero of the war. It was the Marines under Craig who saved the Pusan perimeter, who made the landing at Inchon. So Eddie Craig, kudos. He was the hero. The biggest losers of the war, in Sloan's eyes, Truman, MacArthur. In the Army, Lieutenant General Edward Almond, who commanded 10th Corps. So leaderships matter. Elections matter. Right now, in the United States military, thanks to cultural trends in general, and a special thanks to Obama, the American military is woke. The leadership is woke. I've seen enough impact at the troop level. I've seen statements from generals like Milley. The military is been liberalized, politicized, and they're not ready. Finally, Sloan has one passage that I'm going to read from page 174. Here you go. The plight of George Washington's ragtag army in the winter of 1776-77 stands out among the darkest moments of the American Revolution. The panicked flight of Union soldiers after their rout at the First Battle of Bull Run in 1861 ranks as the U.S. Army's lowest point in the Civil War. And the interval of shock and dismay following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 surely represents the rock bottom of our military leadership's confidence and public image during World War II. And so he equates 1950, July, August, September, retreating to the Pusan perimeter. He equates that time period with all those other serious defeats. Bill Sloan, 1935-2015, the author, worked off and on at the Dallas Times-Herald, authored 16 books on World War II, Korea, and the JFK assassination. He was a graduate of University of North Texas in Denison, Texas, lifelong Methodist, and married to his wife Lana for 43 years. This is a remarkable book. I highly recommend it. And, it is another thing about this book is there's lots of oral history from soldiers. He interviewed a lot of soldiers towards the end of their lives. I mean, this is published in 2009. And so by that time, all the people who'd fought in the Korean War were in their 70s, 80s, and 90s. And so he does a lot of interviews with soldiers and Marines. And so there's a large amount of oral history going on in this book, and that's a special touch as well. And he closes the book well with a section that says the rest of the story. And here he follows up on a lot of the key figures of the war, from privates to generals, and gives what happened to them after the war. And you know, there's a lot of just regular foot soldiers in here, so he doesn't focus on just the generals and the officers. So that was special, and so this is a book that gives you the big picture, but it also gives you individual stories. So I highly recommend it. This is Stab the Dragon, out here.